Yeah, it's prepping it. So let me see if I can get that, and then I can also post that as well.
Okay, meeting is being live streamed. Got it.
On YouTube. So.
All right, Charlie. Thanks. I really appreciate this one, guys. So
Yeah,
we
no
have
problem.
how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So we are 7 now. Okay, we are likely to have numbers the way I see it, but those who want the knowledge are here. Yeah, we can start, Charlie.
It's a video saying it says private.
No problem. I'll mute myself just FYI.
Yeah. This one is saying it says private, but I made it public. Let me switch accounts to see. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I am about to share that right now. As soon as I can find my WhatsApp. Okay. So, yeah. Okay, got it on.
Tony.
All right. I think we should be good.
Awesome.
How you doing, boss?
We're doing all right. Fine.
Yes, sir.
Long time.
Charlie, we did come pipe knowledge small.
Very, very necessary.
These people, if you don't know their ways,
Maybe
they can't do Ldap. Gav could tell.
How you doing, boss?
You need the right invoice given.
We're doing all right.
Fine.
By the time you realize that they issue you VAT invoice and things.
It's not easy, easy. We're right now, it'd be like 21%.
All right, Ali, I think we can. Well, I think we should be good now.
Okay.
Yeah, fire on. We're ready for you.
Yeah. All right. It's public. Okay. So I see Israel, you're actually on YouTube, right?
Yeah, I'm on YouTube, but I'm not streaming on YouTube now.
Okay. All right. I wanted to make sure it's public. So all right.
Okay. Do you want me to test it? Check it.
Please, test it out. Let's see.
Oh, hold up. I can do that now.
Yeah, let's see.
Where's the link? Oh, there you go. Okay.
I posted it here.
Yeah, I got it. So I'll confirm. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah, you're on.
Okay. All right, cool. Jervin.
Yeah. Okay, I thought your name is first, so you should start.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's admit some people. So yeah, it looks like
as many.
Can you hear me?
As many who wants to join, I beg.
Yes, I'm at they're coming in. Clicking admit us and when they're coming in. So yeah, I'll say good evening and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. This is going to be our session on Ldap. This is just going to be just an intro level, not too detailed. If this goes well and we think we want to go much more detailed in the future, we may have maybe subsequent series on this. So today's just going to be on Ldap. Most of you know me as Kofi 80. So my full name is Kofi Asamoah. And then I have Jervin up here on the line. And then we have our good friend ChatGPT, who was also involved in this whole work. So we had to make sure that we represent everybody on this slide. All right. So that's all we have in here too. So, all right. So let's move on to the agenda. So we're going to start with the Active Directory Domain Services overview, aka Active Directory, or the AD that most of us know. And then we'll talk about Ldap itself. And then once we have an understanding on the basics principle of what Ldap is and what it can be used for, then we'll look into how, as OffSec people, we can use in our operations. And then also for the defensive, we don't have much for you guys, but we still got a lot for you. So we'll talk about some few things you can do for some, defensive stuff like, home, house cleaning. And then we'll go over questions and answers. All right. So Jervin, if you don't mind. So let's start with the one-on-one on just AD. Again, not in details, just an overview, and then walk through to how we got into Ldap, because most of the protocols that we use in our technology nowadays came about as a need or as a result of some sort of technology, and we had to find a way to communicate. So we created a protocol for those things, right? Now, for most of us who ever schooled in Ghana, went to high school in Ghana, you know what this is, right? This is a chop box, all right? If you're not from Ghana, my apologies, but for those who went to school in Ghana, this is a chop box. Now, the question maybe you may be asking yourself is, how does a chop box relate to directory services, right? Well, let me give a background. So most of us, we didn't pay attention, right? But Chopbox was actually where we had all of our stuff in school in. So you have your Milo somewhere at the corner, you have your shitter, you have your pair of shoes, you have your school uniform all iron out, like stack up, you have your singlet, you have your boxes, and then for the mommy bees and the daddy bees, you have your cornflakes, you have your Milos, and then you have your needles, you have your sugar, that kind of thing, right? But the whole point here is this thing was used to organize, right? It was used to organize all of our items in a very nice to find way, right? And that is what is going to help us walk into what DS is, or direct services is all about, right? So let's go. So just like any other, corporations, enterprise, right? You have all these items. You have your IDS, you have your IPS, you have your routers, you have your switches, you have servers, computers, printers. All these are different items, similar to how we have all these things from high school, but we have to find a way to organize and structure or store this information or these, these assets or items, right? So that is how DS came about. Directory services came about back in the 1990s, and was basically used for a way for us to organize and enterprise assets. Okay, and to do that, we need to have a particular protocol, which was the X.500 protocol, and that was used to define the structure on how network systems or assets were all organized or maintained within an organization. Of course, with that X.500 came out, then it also introduced another way to organize and structure data and assets, and that was the directory access protocol. So you can see the transition, right? DS was introduced, a protocol was used, and the protocol was used to build up the DAP. And then it didn't leave there, right? We also built up upon the DAP to build a hierarchical structure known as a directory information tree. Now, Jervin, I know you know something about date here, but most people may not know what the date is because you have seen using this. Most of us, as soon as you get your DA, what is the first thing you do? Dumping credentials.
Yeah. And like Kofi's saying, we've probably seen ntds.dates constantly, right? Where people try to get everything from the domain. Now, you potentially may not have thought about it. I guess everybody probably knows what NT stands for because we've seen NT in a lot of Windows technologies. Yeah. We've seen DS now, right? So we probably know what that means. And then the dates now makes a lot of sense, right? Like Kofi's describing. Yeah. Essentially is that's hierarchy that contains all this really juicy information.
Yeah. So that was used to build this hierarchical structure. As you can see here, as an example here, just a very plain one to understand, right? So we move into, DAP was used to build or provide the date, and the date was used to organize directory information. What is that? That will be, let's say, your domain, or let's say the DC, which will be like the extension of your domain. Let's say the .net, .corp, .local, .com. These are all part of the higher level. Within each one of these, we have what we call the organization. And then within organization, we have the organization unit, or the OU, and then also the person. So each person within an organization, according to date, has their structure going all the way up to the highest level, which could be a .net, .org, .corp, .local. All right. So Jervin, let's move on. All right. So one of the most well-known now, Most of you may not even know this existed because all of us are used to Microsoft Active Directory, right? But for the old people, I see some people like, bouncing their head. Yeah, I see you, Sensi. I see them like, you guys are showing, the old guys are showing.
Network.
All right. So Novell Directory Services was actually one of the most earliest version of directory services, and that was used to provide a way to centralize and also organize all of our network resources. Again, resources are what? The stuff that make everything come together. Your IDS, your IPS, your routers, your switches, all the old stuff were all used and organized based on these DS services. And of course, 1990, Microsoft of all people, right, of all organizations, because most of organizations were going for Microsoft. Most shops had about 90-something% of Microsoft products, or OSs and Microsoft Windows OSs, right? So Microsoft introduced the Active Directory Domain Services, aka Active Directory. So if you're talking about AD, most people think AD is just like the big, it's just on its own, but no, it is actually part of directory services, just like how Novell, directory services is all about. It's the same thing with Microsoft Active Directory. So AD is actually Active Directory Domain Services, and that was introduced as part of Windows 2000 Server. And of course, it provides a way to organize and then also standardize management of network resources, such as adding computers to a domain, creating users, creating groups, all these group policies. We use AD to organize all these within our network infrastructure.
Yeah,
all right.
Awesome. Yeah, like Kofi mentioned, there are lots of AD stuff like Active Directory Certificate Services, Active Directory Federation, but like Kofi said, AKA this, anytime we refer to AD, we'll synonymously be referring to the domain services.
All right. So again, just recap again, the ADDS majority of its job is to store and organize information. So, most of you here probably have gone to the office at one point, and then you are going to print, let's say, an invoice, and then you don't have to plug in any printer to your computer, but magically you click a button and then the printer on your second floor begins to print out that invoice, right? And you'll be like, okay, how did all this happen, right? Well, the backbone or whatever is happening behind the scenes is all because of ADDS, or the Active Directory, because it is used to organize all of our resources, such as our servers, our volumes, our printers, users, phone numbers, computer accounts, and all those authorized users that are on the same network. Okay, that is what ADDS does as part of its functions. All right, let's go. All right, so one thing, so we have terminologies, right? You come across a whole bunch of them. Jevin just threw out some of them here, talking about federation and all that, right? But one thing is for certain when it comes to AD environment, and that is all network information are grouped into what we call objects. So objects can be a printer, human being can be an object, your laptop can be an object, a server can be an object, all right? So we classify everything within an AD environment as objects. And of course, as objects, they all have their own function, they all have their features and properties that we'll be talking about as we get into Ldap. So a person within an AD would have a first name as a property. They may have a last name as a property. They may have a phone number as a property. They may have an office location as a property, right? But in the end, they are all part of the ecosystem of what we call the objects. Obviously, there has to be a way for us to be able to protect and also make sure that assets are only accessible by the authorized objects. So within AD, we implement access control by what we call the security descriptor. So for instance, let's say Israel writes this lengthy essay. Okay, now this essay is going to be in a Word document. That Word document is an object in a sense of Active Directory, but it will also have an owner. The owner will be, let's say, I Desmond or Israel Desmond, right? That would be the username, right? And then within that, he would have a discretionary access control list. He would have to provision and maybe give me read-only access. He may be the owner, so that would be the DACO. That is when he just on his own discretion will say, you know what, I want Kofi to be able to view this document, or I want all the groups within our legal department to be able to read this essay, right? And then we also have the system access control list, which by itself is embedded once you create the your document or your the object of, let's say, an essay. So these are all some, not all of them, but on a high level, some access control that are implemented within an AD environment to ensure that access is authorized, or you are authorized to view objects within AD environment.
Yeah, and synonymous with what you would find in, if you've ever played with Cisco routers or switches or any other modern network device, the ACL is the same here, right? The access control list, which contains specific entries that will either permit or deny access based off some other parameter or the other, right? So it's the same logic.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's get into the objects again. Within the object, they are categorized into two, and it's very easy to understand. We have a resource. At some point, the human or the security principal would need to use a resource's capability or whatever the resource has. So within AD, the objects are grouped into two major subgroups, the resources and then also security principal. Resources are mostly things which are providing us something, based on of our needs. So for instance, a printer is used for us to print, something, right? Papers or whatever. Okay, computers can also be used for doing something, calculation, whatever, all right? And also other shared devices may host some files that we may need to use. The security principal is going to be humans or users, or passwords or groups that you belong to. So let's say that we have the IT or the the developers group. That will be part of the security, principal group, or any objects that need to be authenticated, because in the end, you cannot print something on a network without being first authenticated, right? So the security principal has to be something that has authenticate to be able to gain access or permission to use a resource in an AD environment. Okay, so then we've talked about all these things. Let's get into how the Active Directory is structured or built on top of each other. The moment you build an AD environment, the first domain becomes your forest. Okay, so let's say that we have Tony Kwashi on the line, right? Let's say that this person, has a company. It's a global company, or let's say it's, based on a national company, based off in Ghana, right? You build up your first domain. Let's say company.corp, which is based off in Accra, right? So within that, let's say that he also decides to build another office in, let's say, South Africa. Okay, he can have a subdomain for that particular location, and that will be a domain within the forest. So we have the Ghana one, and then we can have the South Africa one. So within the forest, we can have different domains within the forest. And you can see the kind of the pyramid scheme, right? So we have the forest at the top, and we can have branches of domains within that, forest. And then within the, domain itself, we can have organizational units. So let's say that within the, Accra office or the Ghana domain, we can have an OU for only accountants, okay? Because they will have specific, they will have specific features that are unique to that particular, OU. It will be, made up of only accountants within the domain. The same domain though, so we can have a cross-organization unit without having to be on the same domain. So within the Accra or the Ghana domain, we can have the accounting department, they can have their own organizational unit, and we can also have, let's say, legal. They will also have their own organizational unit. The most easiest one to understand is users. Every AD by default has the users OU created, because in the end, you are still going to have users within your organization, right? So the structure is forest, domains, or units within it. And that is what you see on the right side of the image you see on the right side.
Yeah, also just to add, one of the primary reasons for this sort of small compartmentalizations or creating like even smaller groups within the larger group is so you can effect specific controls. So for example, you can apply a specific set of group policies, which is another term. Essentially, as the name implies, it's a set of policies that govern specific behavior. And you can say, hey, those in, like Kofi said, the accountants group cannot do X, Y, Z. And those in, say, the IT group can do X, Y, Z, right? So it gives you a lot more control in that regard.
Yeah. Patrick has a question.
Yes, Patrick, please go ahead.
I want to know, so can a resource be placed into two different OUs?
Yeah, so let's say that you, Patrick, you are in the IT department, right? But at the same time, you're also a developer. And let's say we create an OU for IT alone, and then we create another OU for developers alone. But you have both functions. You need access to be in an IT department, right? And there are resources. At the same time, you need access to get to, let's say, your interior or your internal GitHub for all developers. So yes, you can be placed within each of these OU.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then perhaps when we get a little bit into the structure and you see how it's defined and how the whole domain structure extracts information and leverages all of these things, it may start making a bit more sense to you. And you can also start playing with them, right? You can start trying to mix and match things and see how that works out.
All right, sure. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so now we've talked about just the high level, how the AD looks like, but who are the main players at the background? Who makes this, put all this together as a glue to manage and run these operations for us? One of the most important service or systems on your AD environment is a domain controller. The domain controller, like I said, is like the White House of US, or Ghana is like what? Jubilee House, or what names do we have for the seat of government in Ghana?
I'm not sure if it's still
Flagstaff,
right? All right, so that is where everything
the place that they stash their money,
So that is where everything is managed. So the domain controller is where everything is managed. It runs the AD domain services, or the AD domain services, manages all the users, all the computers, all the servers, printers, and all that. The objects we talked about, all of them are managed by the domain controller. And among its other services that it provides, the two of the most well-known ones, which is now going to now sink into our topic of the night, which is Ldap, is the authentication and authorization. Because at some point, you are going to have to log into your computer, and then the AD or the domain controller would have to authenticate who you are. And then once you're authenticated, if you need to access resources on the network, then it has to be an authorization. So going back to Patrick's question about if a user can be on the same two OUs, and also referring to Jervin, authorization is when, after authentication, it determines if you belong to the IT department, are you authorized to view invoices in a finance department? All right, this is very important because sometimes you get confused here. I know I recall that I had somebody reaching out to me about the person had a password hash, right? And they were trying to access or get like a code, RCE using PSSEC. And it wouldn't work. It was a valid password hash, it was Active Directory domain user password hash. And it was, the domain controller had actually validated that the person has access on the domain, but they couldn't achieve RCE on a remote system. And they were asking me, well, I have a valid password hash. Why am I not being able to get a remote code access on a remote system? And I told the person that, yes, that particular user and their hash are authenticated in a domain, but they do not have authorization on a remote system we're trying to pass a hash into. Because to pass a hash against a system, you need to have an admin level on one of the files, and one of the, shares, especially either the C or the admin shares. All right. So even though this account is authenticated that they do exist on the AD, they don't have authorization on that particular system. So your hash wouldn't work. So people get confused here. Just because you think you're authenticated does not mean you have authorization at all. And that is one of the functions of the domain controller, is it provides both authentication and then also authorization. Yes, sir. Desmond.
So the authentication is as good as the permission of that object.
Yep. Yes, sir. Yeah.
All right.
Okay. All right, Jarvin.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. So now I think things are beginning to make sense now, because so far we have bored you guys with AD stuff, but we wanted to give you the background before we jump into Ldap, because it wouldn't make sense to jump into Ldap without you having a foundation on why we got to Ldap. So AD actually relies on different technologies and protocols, including DNS, DHCP, and a whole bunch of other services and protocols. One of them is Ldap. And Ldap is one of the major protocols that helps within the ecosystem of the AD environment. It helps, or it ensures, directory access protocol for storing and also looking up objects within an environment. So now we are moving slightly from AD and now jumping into Ldap on how it becomes useful within the AD environment.
Yeah, and Kofi, to your point, I actually have a question for our audience. I'm just curious. I'm confident that a majority of us here do not use Ldap independent of AD, right? We probably, the only time we interact or have used the protocol Ldap is when we used AD. I don't know if, is there anybody here who runs Ldap like independently, like maybe Open Ldap or something, like to manage some resource in the environment? Let's see. Okay, so by the silence, I'm assuming that we all run, or our only interaction with Ldap primarily has been with AD. So it serves a very good point that we did talk about AD before Ldap, right? Just to highlight that as well. Okay, so a little Ldap 101. Like Kofi said, there's quite a bit of theory and a lot of detail if you pick any specific topic. Now, however, we want to give the high-level overview. We'll delve into some of the minor or the underlying details, but we'll skip quite a bit of it, right? We want to make sure that we properly address the technology and how it's employed. Now, we've already established previously that AD relies heavily on this particular protocol. Now, Ldap, you may see, has the L in front of it, the lightweight. And Kofi had already pointed out that there was a protocol prior to this, right, called DAP. Now, DAP was a bit heavy and resource intensive. Hence, the development of Ldap. It's supposed to be a lighter version of DAP and multi-platform compatible. So it has become the de facto way of interacting with directory services now. Because it's predicated on the DAP protocol, it also uses the X500 syntax. Now, you may see these ports come up or show up consistently, 389, 636, 3269. The first two are primarily used for Ldap, simple authentication, and secure communication via Ldap. And then the subsequent one is primarily for global catalog. This is secure global catalog also, just FYI. 3268 is leveraged for regular global catalog interaction. Now, once we are familiar with Ldap, the global catalog, you can just think of it as it's a partial copy of all the objects in the Active Directory environment. So you can think of it as all the objects Kofi mentioned about. When I say partial, it's only partial in regards to the fact that it actually has all the objects, but only some of the most used attributes. And we'll talk about what attributes are and all of those things later and how it relates to this. Now, you'll be interested to find out that you don't need any specific privileges to do a bind in Ldap, and you can also be just a regular domain user. You don't have to be any advanced user at all. That's a
Javin, I
question.
think Desmond has his hands up.
Yes, Desmond, please go ahead.
Gav, how is the catalog stored? Is it like a cache?
Yeah, something like that, right? It's stored on the domain controller itself, and it's primarily what it's used for replication. So, for example, if
okay,
so it's used for quick, and then also when you are doing like a cross-domain interaction, somebody wants to interact with the data in the domain, and they don't require a referral from the domain controller, they can easily just go to the global catalog and just infer that data, right? So you can think of it as a cache that is primarily used just to provide quick access to information, and also just to do like quick replication as well.
All right. Okay, cool.
Awesome. But good question. It's very important you ask that because it shows up a lot in a lot of processes. Right. Okay. If there are no more questions, I'll jump to the next slide. There's a question from Adam. Adam, please go on.
Thank you. So I see the port 389, which is the Ldap, and then you have the 636, which is the secure one. Is it a case that when they were designing Ldap, the first one that came up was the normal Ldap, which is 389, and then later the secure one came up? Because the question is, why is it that by default we use the unsecure one?
That's a very good question.
Jerry, you want me to take that?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
All right. So this goes back to the fundamentals of cybersecurity in general. Back in the days when technology was developed, they didn't think Homo sapiens would end up being malicious. All right. So the first thing they thought about was the usability and functionality of most of the protocols. That is why we have Telnet, FTP, HTTP. All these were built under the assumption that we'll be good people and good citizens without any malicious intent. So IT in general was built without security built into it. It was over time that when we realized that we are being malicious was when all this additional security was built into the protocols. That is why we still have FTP, and then we have what? Secure FTP or FTPS. We have HTTP and we have HTTPS, right? And then we have what? Telnet, which is now even being deprecated and being replaced by SSH, right? So that is the that is the answer to your question. It is not even just Ldap. It is just has been the fundamentals of cybersecurity and technology in general. So this happens to be one of them. It was built up without thinking about security. And then eventually we thought, you know what, let's just put in security and then secure the communication between endpoints. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does perfectly well.
Yeah, all right. Desmond.
I couldn't have answered that. Yes.
That was swift. My follow-up question is, Ldap S, does it need like IPsec in the environment, or you can have like a separate certificate in infrastructure to do that?
Yeah, and I see why you're a security person. You're already thinking about all of these things, right? So the 3.8, the one that goes over 3.8.9, does not support any form of obfuscation or security or encryption or anything like that. But if you do secure, you can attempt to do secure authentication by something they call SASL, right? And SASL allows you to introduce things like even Kerberos authentication. You can bring in certificates as well, even more secure authentication if you choose not to use simple authentication, right? So there is the feature to introduce security into Ldap itself.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about IPsec. That could be something that Israel, we can maybe look into in the future if we do any follow-up. But I know for sure that yes, certs should be okay for you to your own certificate. Internal one should be good enough for you to implement the SSL version. The Ldap.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the most popular ones are TLS, and then pretty much doing some form of PKI in with Ldap.
Yeah, your own internal stuff. Yeah.
But I've seen people also run Ldap queries over SSH, which they believe is secure. So then they are sending their connections via an SSH communication, right? You could also do it over a GR return or pretty much anything you want, really. But
and I'm not surprised about that.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised because and I know this is not about PowerShell, but you'll be surprised to know that we can actually write PowerShell over HTTP. So yeah.
Awesome. We spent quite a lot of time on this first slide. It shows how interesting this particular concept is. Yeah. Now, let's talk about this. I don't know if it's the smallest attribute or the smallest unit, right? But primarily LDAP data is stored in something we call attributes. Now, this is like a key value pair. So if you've played with dictionaries, I think lists or anything like that in any programming language, you may have seen that, right? For example, an attribute will be like we have in here, right? Male, which corresponds to a value called victim1@wakanda.corp. Now, typically an attribute is predefined, right, by something we call an object class. What that simply means is that it's how do I say this simply? It is, and without repeating the word object class, think of it as an overarching principle, right, or definition for something. So if I say a person, that person is that object class. And so a person can have a name, person can have an email address, XYZ, right? That is the object class. Now, this is also predefined in something we call a schema, where the schema defines what attributes the object class can have. So on its own, if I showed you something like an attribute like, for example, position, and position being the name, and then the value was last born, perhaps you may not exactly know what I'm talking about, but you could make some inference, right? That the last born might be because, well, it's the last child of whatever, right? But that's simply what the attribute is, the smallest unit that you can have. And that's what the basic units for data stored in LDAP is. Now, moving on from there, if you put a collection of attributes together under a particular context, then you're giving more meaning to it. So for example, the example I used previously, where we have like position and then last name. If I said, okay, this belongs to a person from this family, right? So say the Asamoah family has an object class of children, and at that object class, there is Stephen, and Stephen is, his position is the last child, then everything starts making a lot more sense, right? I've put all those key value pairs under a single entry. And so now you get to see that, oh, I'm actually talking about Kofi and his relation to his family, right, as the last child. Kofi, I don't know if you're the last child or not, but I apologize if I've demoted you, right?
Look at you.
But
forget them.
Forget them, man. All right. So essentially, those are the basic units, right? Now you may see certain components here like DN, CN, OU. I will talk about these later. However, just a quick one. The DC that you see is not the domain controller, right? It's something we call the domain components. The OU we have already seen, that stands for the organizational unit. And then we have the CN, which stands for the common name. And I'll talk about these much later. And then we have something we call the DN, which stands for the distinguished name. But just so that we have we're clear on this, the DC, if it's a domain controller, I refer to that as a domain controller. But when you see that in relation to LDAP, it's making reference to what we call the domain component. And I'll show you how that fits under the DITs, which I believe should be in the next slide. Now we're going back to the directory information tree, right? Like Kofi showed us previously. Let's see if we can follow on from our previous examples, right? The smallest unit is the attributes. We put those attributes together under a single name. It becomes an entry. Say we have multiple entries. How do we manage that, right? It will become very confusing. For example, if I use the analogy I used previously about Kofi and his family, if we had several other branches of Kofi's family coming from the ancestry, right? How do we manage that? This is where the hierarchical, is that the word? The hierarchy, right, of branching out in relation to the DITs comes in, right? So in the directory information tree, we can say, hey, this is, the family comes all the way from Adam, right? And then from Adam, they had the Asamoah family, and then a branch of that And then we have all of these other families coming out, right? Now, typically, this is how you would read value from the distinguished name, right? I'm going to read this from the right to the left. And from the very top, we have the roots. You don't have to worry about the roots, right? It's simply, you can think of it as a DN with 0 values, right? It has 0 entries, 0 attributes. There's nothing really there, right? But if we start from DC, which is the domain component corp, we know that under that DC, we have another organization called Wakanda. And then we have an organizational unit under that DC Wakanda called users. And under that, we have the person or common name victim1, right? Now, all of this, we're specifying that with something we call the distinguished name. So you can think of the DN as a path, right? So if I wanted to find victim1, I can start from corp. If I go to the organization Wakanda and go into the users organizational unit, I'll find this person called victim1. Now, this is sort of the structure that the DIT uses to store stuff, right? And you can refer to this as the distinguished name. And we'll see that in actual practice, right? Okay, if there aren't any questions, I'll jump to the next slide. I also share some resources so you can-
Israel has a question.
Yes, sorry, please go on, Israel.
Yeah, okay, so I was going to go. Maybe I missed it, but why do we have a double DC? One is domain component and the other is a domain controller, or they are both domain components?
They are both domain components. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so in fact, yeah, and sorry to cut you off. So in fact, the case is that you may even have more than 2 DCs. So let's say that you have a subdomain of accra.company.corp. You are going to have, and we have a user called, like, I Desmond. Okay. Now, according to this particular, DN, we are going to have a CN, which is going to be you, the username, like Desmond. We're going to have you belong to an OU of users. Matter of fact, you may even belong to an OU of legal. So let's say you belong to OU of legal. So we have I Desmond, OU of legal, and then we have DC of Accra, DC of company, and a DC of corp. So every one of the component that makes the domain structure is going to have their own DC or the component itself. So
makes sense. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, no problem. Oh, I think I may have an example. So something like this, right? Yeah. Wakanda.corp, right? So we have both this DC corp, and under that we have another DC called Wakanda. We could have like several branches, right? And I think we'll see that also once I start showing you how we can make manual queries. So, but good questions. Please keep them coming. Like I had mentioned previously, the DN stands for the distinguished name. I almost said domain name. And that's essentially is the path that allows us to trace out an object and see where it exists in the context of the domain, right? Now, a DN can have multiple attributes. We've looked at some of the attributes at the onset. We'll look at some more specific and special ones that we may find interesting. That will help us as we work as both, let's say, security people, right? Because essentially, I don't think there's any criminal here, I hope. I don't think Kofi is a criminal, or Israel, or Adam, or anybody, or Patrick, or is criminals. And our goal is to secure the environment, right? So we'll see how we can leverage these particular
Adam is a suspicious character.
No comments. I'll also stop throwing out the baits for Israel to pick on people, right? Now, like I mentioned, the DC that stands for the domain component. You can think of it as the domain name, right? You see that a lot. The OU we have already discussed, and there's a CN. Kofi said something surname earlier on. There's also an SN that you may see. You may also, in fact, see something called the RDN, which stands for the relative DN. And these are just the small components that make up the DN itself, right? You don't have to worry about any of those terms for now, and we'll look at them later. Now, if you remember the very first slide, there was a point there, was a bullet point that talked about the fact that any domain user can make a bind request, right? Or can perform a bind operation. Now, what are operations? These are essentially, as the name implies, things that a person with valid, well, you don't even actually need valid credentials. You can attempt to do it, right? But this would be the regular activity that an LDAP client can perform in an LDAP environment. And one of the things we'll focus on today would be the bind operation. Essentially allows the user to authenticate to the LDAP server and say, hey, I want to search for this information. I want to compare this information. I want to add, delete, modify, etc. And also unbind, right? You can actually unbind. But the bind precedes all of these other operations, right? Without binding, without authenticating and being validated, you cannot perform any of these other things, right? Unless you create like an anonymous logon and anybody can just do what they want, really. Hopefully you don't do that in your environments. And if you set up AD well, this should be the default. I don't think you can do that on modern AD setups. And this perhaps may address your question, both Nuruddin and Israel, right? You can perform a simple authentication, which is what is going to happen by default if you set up your own external LDAP system. If you use AD, I believe that's AD now is built with LDAP version 3, which inherently has secure authentication. And so you won't be performing a simple authentication, right? A simple authentication does not obfuscate the credentials that you send. And so a third party who sits between the connection or has a means of seeing the traffic will be able to fish out the data you're sending across. Now, you can also alternatively apply, and we recommend this, a more secure authentication setup, and one of such that's specified by the LDAP RFC is simple authentication and security layer, SASL. I always forget what it stands for, but essentially you can introduce security. You can even do Kerberos for your LDAP authentications. Okay. Yeah, now we have a nice diagram here that Kofi procured. This simply is depicting the LDAP clients interacting with the LDAP server, and then we have Active Directory. Now, you can see that we have actually separated these. Now, in a typical setup, your LDAP server is your Active Directory server, right? However, in a more expanded environment of where you want to do a bit more scaling, you can actually separate these out and have a separate instance of an LDAP server interacting with the directory server or the directory service to extract the information for you. Now, you would still have to go through the process of the bind, which needs to authenticate you. So the LDAP server will perform these. And then once you have been properly authenticated, it's going to go out and retrieve the specific information that you want.
And it's a good point you made here, because I know some of you here may work in a small organization and you may be wondering, do I always have to have like a separate server running LDAP services and then have domain controller being on the same, different servers? You don't have to, because deploying your environment depends on how much resources that you have, right? Some of these protocols can run on single server or separate servers. So this picture is just showing us how we can break it down into separate. So this one is showing that you can run your LDAP on a single server for authentication and then have your AD environment being run by your domain controller. If you don't have the resources to do that, you can have a server running your DC and at the same time running your, your LDAP. The same thing goes with, let's say, DNS. If you work in internal network, right, most of your DCs run your DNS as well, or even DHCP. But if you have money and you have resources, or even major organizations may have these services or technology running on separate servers. So it all depends on your environment and how much money or resources you have to, scale up things and then just have them in silos.
Yep. Or if you work with Kofi, you have a lot more money. Israel has a question.
That's one has a hands up.
Quick question, guys. From an infrastructure point, what are LDAP's dependencies?
I
mean, the critical ones that if I tamper with, LDAP will fail.
Well, I'd say that the first thing is you should be able to perform your bind, right? It's essential. Yeah. So whatever facilitates network communication between the client and the server will be primary, right? Because otherwise everything breaks. I also want to state this, which we'll talk about also, right? You always have to do that particular process. So you do the bind, you perform the operation, and then there's an unbind. So the connection actually breaks. It's not persistent. If you want to perform another action, you have to go ahead and do the bind again. And then you could leverage things like TGTs in memory and do like a single sign-on. But essentially, the connection terminates once you're done, right? So you need to have communication so you can always perform that action.
Yeah, go on.
Adam.
Is there a reason why the communication is not persistent? It's by design, right?
Yeah, it's
by design.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's is it a security decision or an infrastructure decision?
That is hard to tell because it's built in the protocol. So that is hard to tell. Yeah. So yeah, it's meant, and the thing is, Ldap is mostly, from what I know, is mostly used for querying, just searching for stuff, right? So search and then done. And so going back to dependencies, right? You are going to search for something. There has to be some link between the Ldap server and then the DC, because the Ldap on its own doesn't have anything. It's just an intermediary. It's a protocol. So the dependency, one of them, what I know is at least there has to be a DC that is going to give you that information. Okay, so if you break a communication, as you can see, these two, in fact, this is actually very perfect, links. You can see a link between the user and then the AD environment. And the AD. If any of these break, these are just a basic dependencies. If you break the connection between the Ldap server and the AD environment, then you have nothing. If the user cannot bind to the Ldap server, you can't do anything either. So this is like a very good picture to show you minimum, these are the two dependencies that needs to exist for the Ldap service to work. Adam?
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
So my question is, shouldn't DNS also be one of the minimum requirements, or is it the case that by default, DNS will always be available so far as Ldap is there?
That is a good question. So there's some things are just by default. And yeah, you're right, because there has to be some named resolution.
Things will kill this boy. Hey!
So there has to be some named resolution, all right? So yeah, you're right. There has to be default. DNS also has to be, be working. But we think it's by default built into it, that it has to be.
Yeah, very good question, right?
Yeah.
Also why Microsoft will force your domain controller to be your DNS server, right? Just so that you don't break anything.
Yeah, unless you choose to have a different system for DNS.
Yeah, very good point. As you will see in the subsequent examples, that we will actually be using domain names, right? We want
Adam has the answer.
Yeah. So I want to know if you can touch a bit on trust relationship and how it could impact the whole Ldap operation. Let's say client interacting with the Active Directory service, because we've seen some time where you could discover assets on a network and then you try to query it and you are not able to perform anything at all with it remotely, and then physically attend to the device, you could see that the device has lost its trust. Is there anything behind the mind of Microsoft when they were considering this trust mechanism in Active Directory setup?
That's a good question. Kofi, you want to attempt that? I have an answer, but I want to hear what you have to say.
I don't have an answer, so I will actually let you go because I don't know the minds of Microsoft when they were doing these things. So I will say, you can go ahead and
the question is like avoiding macros.
Okay, this man likes to throw a lot of shots. So I'll posit this reason, right? I think that the primary reasons for the trust was to establish some form of security. Microsoft has been bashed for a long time in relation to how well they have developed and secured Active Directory, which I think is a bit unfair considering, or maybe it's fair, I guess, they are taking a lot of money for this sort of setup. But if you've operated in AD environments for a while, you can see how very complex that infrastructure is. And client features and requests for upgrades and all sorts of things would push them to the point where they would want to put in some form of security. For example, let's talk about like a simple relation between the client and the Ldap server itself. There has to be, if you choose to go with the more secure authentication, there has to be some form of established trust where you can leverage things like certificates to perform that particular action. The subsequent referral from the server to the directory service will also require some trust there as well. Right? So I think that was primarily because of security. There may be other considerations, but those are the ones that I have seen so far, right? Certainly nothing else to do with connectivity or anything like that, right? They just wanted to make sure that all connections throughout was somewhat secure. Okay.
All right, great, thank you.
No problem at all, but good question. I see we are dealing with security people, so a lot of security related questions. Now, this particular slide, I think we have already discussed this ad nauseum. I don't know, Kofi, if you want to say anything about this.
Yeah, so this is just basically what we gave you guys, the previous image, right? I mean, the figure. And this is just the step-by-step process of using example. For instance, we have, let's say, a user called P. Lumumba, right? P. Lumumba wants to print something out or maybe scan something. And he is going to search for a scanner on the AD environment. So the first step is the user, which is going to be P. Lumumba, or what we call the directory user agent, will connect to the Ldap server. And then, the second step is, and now this can happen, the first and second step can actually happen, or the third can happen at the same time on one line. All right, and you guys will see us using Ldap search within Linux to do that. So they'll normally provide, they'll connect to the Ldap server, and then also have their search query looking for the specific, scanner. In this case, let's say on a fifth floor. And then it is going to also require this person's password. So once they hit the username and their search query, they'll now be prompted for their credential or their password to authenticate. So that will be the third step. And then the Ldap searches the directory and then returns the specific resources such as the scanner to the user, and then disconnects. And this is where it comes in with the non-persistence with the Ldap protocol. So essentially, it goes like a 5-step process for just one line of code or one line that you run for Ldap search.
Yep. And then you see this once we hit that demo, if nothing breaks, of course. Yeah, okay, let's move on. And this is essentially what Kofi just described, right? Where the client makes the request, and the Ldap server, which acts as a proxy, will send the request to the resource, extract the required information, and then break the connection once it's returned that information. Yeah, and then this is where we pray that nothing breaks, and also that I share the right screen. And so I'm going to stop the share right now, make sure that I close everything on my laptop. I can find the VM that I'm using for today's demo, and then we can look at it. All right, so if you're wondering why the delay, I'm just typing a password in. I just want to make sure that I don't type the password into the username field so everybody can see it.
You can do it, we won't see.
Yeah, we don't actually care.
Of course, it's your password, so I care,
no,
right?
no.
Okay.
Look at this guy.
That one we care.
All right, hopefully you can see my screen.
It's coming up.
It's okay. Okay, let me know if you can see it now.
Yeah, we can.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Because
hold on. Let me see. Hold on. Let me see. I don't know, but my countdown is almost up. Let's see.
Okay.
Did I lose you guys?
No, I'm still here.
Okay, let's go. All right.
All right.
For some reason, Zoom got me scared a bit. It was like counting down to 0.
Okay.
All right, yeah, let's go.
All right. Awesome. We will demonstrate regular operations of Ldap, and then we'll also look at Ldap for offensive use, simply just taking advantage of how it works as attackers or as attackers would. And then we'll look at how best we can protect ourselves or some of the things we can do to make it a lot safer. We've already looked at Ldap and its operations and the various components. There's also one very key thing that we haven't touched on yet called filters, right? So for example, how do I tell the Ldap server to extract or pull only users or user information, right? What kind of information is relevant in that particular regard? I'll have a link here, which we will share subsequent to this call, which contains, it's a Microsoft TechNet, it's a blog or article of some sort. Essentially, what they have here is a lot of filters that we can leverage. I hope this is big enough for you guys to see. If you have the kind of eyesight that I have, then I have to make this a lot bigger so you can see this. Essentially, the filters allow us to specify what kind of information we want to extract. Now, just to be thorough and just do like a regular operation of Ldap, I'll minimize this. I'm going to search for everything, right? Using a small variation. Now, also because I don't want to type this out, that's the quickest way to do a demo fail, is to type and try to be like, you're in a movie or something. Also take me like, I'm very slow when I type, so it'll take me a while. But essentially what we have here is I'm using a tool called Ldap Search. And there are other additional Ldap related tools on Kali, right? So we have Ldap. If I do this, you can see there are a number of Ldap related commands. We can do add, operation, compare, delete, and so on and so forth, right? Let's close this. And I'll explain the syntax that we are observing here. Let me do a Control-Shift-T again, and just do Ldap search, and I'll do a -H. Hopefully, I don't have any of your passwords in your Kofi. I want to highlight some of the main options that I'll be using, or switches, right? One of the ones that we'll be focusing on will be -H, which essentially is how I will specify the host that I want to interact with. So over here, you can see that I have these options in the specific option, specifying the domain controller that I want to extract the information from. Now, in this case, the domain controller happens to be our Ldap server, right?
Yeah,
also is a directory, contains a directory that I'll be extracting that information from. And then the -else just specifies that I want my output to be in the LDIF format. That's LDIF. That's the Ldap data information format. Essentially, it just gives us a standardized human readable form of the data when it's returned to us, right? And then I'll use the -X to say that I want to do a simple authentication. Now, remember I had mentioned previously, we have simple, and then you can also do SSL or do TLS or some other secure form of authentication.
Yeah.
And then we have the -D. Now, the -D means that I'm going to specify the bind DN, right? Now, we know what bind means, right? Bind means I'm going to authenticate, right? And we know that the DN is the distinguished name, right? So that's the path for the user. You can write the DN in this form, right? You can say, no, this is a lot easier to read, right? So I have a dummy user who is in the bast.wakanda.ct domain. And then I'm using,
sorry, did you say the Ldap search is a Kali default?
Yes, it should be in Kali by default. At least the last few Kalis that I've used should be there.
Okay. All right.
You find it in, okay.
I'm going to check.
All right, you should have a number of them: Ldap search, Ldap add, Ldap remove, delete.
Oh yeah,
so,
okay. Ldap is here. Thank you.
Awesome. All right.
Ldap search is there.
Awesome. And then -W to say prompt for the password. Now, I could type the password in the one-liner. We all know that's not a good idea because, well, shoulder surfing, etc. I could just say prompt me for the password so I can type that in. That's a little hidden. Although not very safe, since I'm still doing like a simple authentication. And then we have the -B, which stands for the base DN, right? So the base DN means that it's the base. This is where I'm going to start my search from. I'm starting my search from city, which I know is like the top suffix, Wakanda and Bast. You can also read that from here, right? City, Wakanda, Bast. Now, this sort of base DN is always read from right to left. So you can see this is the hierarchy, and it comes all the way down. And you can see that I have DC equals Bast, DC equals Wakanda, DC equals city. Now, this is the domain component. And Israel, to your question, you can see in this case, I have even 3 DCs, right? 3 domain components.
Yeah.
And then I'm saying, give me every object, right? You did also remember we talked about object class at the beginning, right? Sort of like the umbrella that we have everything under, right? I could say, give me a specific object class, or I could use Asterisk to say, give me all the object classes, right? Now, before I hit enter, let's see how insecure, we've been talking about how insecure this is, right? And I'm sure that Adam will also be interested in this. Let's do Wireshark. Let's pull this up. And then, sorry, go on, Kofi.
And whilst you're pulling up your Wireshark, I'll give you guys a true war story about Ldap search. In fact, that was my first encounter with Ldap search. So I was doing an internal pen test for this client, right? Now, this client has been an existing client for us, and they take our recommendations to the core. I mean, these guys take our recommendations, build their own environment, and then test every single bit of our findings and ensure that they have fixed everything. So I go in the subsequent year, and man, I hit a brick wall. Responder doesn't work, none of that. I'm getting nothing from these guys, right? But lucky now, I did an SSH password query attack, and I got an entry into one box. Now, this box I got in, it was Linux box. And the first thing I did was to normally, I'll check for history commands on Linux box. And guess what I saw with their Ldap search? They had a password in a command line. So you see how this one, he used a W, the dash uppercase W. If you do not, then you can specify your password in a command line. And that was my golden ticket to the entire, AD environment. So yeah, you never know what you come across in an entire, in a pen test history. But yeah, that was my ticket.
It's funny. I guess, I don't know the client, but we'll pay Kofi back for what he has done to the innocent clients. Right? Essentially, in Wireshark, what I have is just a filter between this curly box and the domain controller I'm interacting with. And I only want to see Ldap-related traffic. And Ldap does work over TCP, so it doesn't really matter even if I take out the TCP. It will only show me Ldap-related traffic, right? And then we'll minimize this. And I'll perform.
You might want to hit enter. Oh, okay, yeah, never mind.
Yeah, okay. We'll see. I'm going to hit enter and I have to type in the password. I'm awful with passwords, so let's see if I can remember what the password is. Yeah, I knew something was going to happen. I'll type in the wrong password.
I think it was the most secure password.
Right, you can see that there is an Ldap interaction here, right? Just a quick one. At least I wanted to do like a valid request, but we can still see what the detail of this communication was. For example, this is the Kali IP talking to the Ldap server over port 389. So immediately we know this is not a secure connection. We also see that it's specified in here in the info that this particular user was leveraging the simple authentication. Now, let's look at the details of the query I just ran, right? You can see I was actually performing a bind request, unsuccessfully, I might add. But in the bind request, we have a few details in here, right? You can see this simple authentication. And then in there, I type in the password, right? And the password is a capital P. That's why I could not perform the right query. But however, we see what just happened, right? We see the bind response from the server. The bind response was, let's look at the code. It was 49. 49 means invalid credentials, that's specified in here. And then once that was completed, there was an unbind request that was sent from the Kali to the box, right?
No persistence.
No persistence, exactly. Yep. Yes.
Okay, so this attack will fail on LDAP-S, right?
So, sorry, please, can you say that again?
This same attack would not be successful if the internal environment is running LDAP-S.
It's still going to, you mean like seeing the credentials, right?
Yeah.
In Rorschach. Yes, I won't be able to see that.
You won't be able to see that. Okay. And then concerning persistence, I just checked. So it's two reasons. The protocol is stateless, and then it was also for resource management.
Yeah.
Right. So thanks.
I'm surprised though, because
normally,
you're talking about UDP. Right, so I'm surprised.
But this is a TCP.
TCP, yeah. And it's so connectionless.
It's weird.
That's weird. Because typically when we talk about connectionless, it's UDP. If you're talking about resource constraint management, it's UDP.
UDP, but you have it all in one here.
Yeah.
You have the opposites in LDAP.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't blame them, right? DAP was very resource intensive. So maybe as they were scaling back, they're like, okay, let's just take out the persistent nature.
Yeah. Okay, so
now I
password right.
Yeah, now I put in the right password. It's also good to have Rorschach, right, just to see. Whilst this is a lot of info, I won't scroll all the way to the top, but I'm saying, give me everything every object class that you have. And this is going to spew out everything that the LDAP server, the directory service has for me, right? So you can see that we have the DN. The DN, like I mentioned, is giving us the path of whatever object that I'm interacting with. We see that this is a group, and we can see the various attributes for that specific group. Now, some of these things may perhaps not be things that you're interested in, but as attackers do, typically what they focus on is, well, what sort of information can I glean from this sort of query that will be helpful to me? And we'll discuss that as we think about how an attacker would approach, or if you're doing a pen test or a red team or some form of assessment, how do you actually leverage the information to best help you gain good insight on the environment, which is one of the primary ways that people leverage LDAP in offensive operations. I don't really see, well, you can leverage if you have like appropriate credentials, you can also modify components in the DITs as well, right? But most of the time, it's just to get a very good understanding of the environments, extract useful information, and then use that information. Let's do a quick check.
Do you want to go up a bit and let's look at least one with an actual user? Okay. But I want that to show it's a system.
Yeah.
Just a side question.
Yeah.
So now that I'm understanding the output from LDAP search, there's a tool called AD Explorer from sysinternals. It's doing pretty much the same thing, but we just with the Windows, GUI, right?
Yes, on the Windows, yes.
Okay.
All right, so cool. We wanted to give you guys exposure to both Linux and Windows, because most of us here are used to Windows stuff. There are plenty of LDAP stuff tools for Windows, plenty of them, but most may not know that Linux can.
That's what they do.
LDAP.
Yeah.
Yes. So and plus you don't need to have graphical user interface. If let's say you're doing a test and you are, let's say, on your Kali and you don't have access to any box on the environment and you happen to have a credential, you can do all these things from your Kali without having to need any graphical user interface on Windows.
Fair.
Yep. Kofi, I think you wanted to talk about something here.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to say, let's show them some, you see, so let's show them something that is actually more person as an object, because they want that to show us computer-based, internal. But as you can see here, we can see the DN has what? The CN is Patrice Lumumba, and the Patrice Lumumba belongs to the users, CN, the DC is Bass, DC Wakanda, and the DC City. But as, Jervin, highlighted, the object, the object class this time is person, because the other one was a group when you went through the other computer. So we can have different kinds of object class. But let's say on offensive operations, you may be interested in only the person object class, so you can harvest all users within the environment for, let's say, parcel spree attack or any other attacks.
Yep. Very good point, right? You can also see there's some very good information. For example, I already know just by doing this that Lumumba.
Yeah, it's a member of domain admins. Yeah.
You can also see password related information, which is something very useful. For example, if their passwords have set to never expire, this is something that you can also leverage, right? Let me do a quick search again. I will run this search. If I show you the Wireshark captcha, you can see that we pretty much have the same information, right? This time we had a successful bind response. And then after it showed me or extracted all the information, there was also the unbind, right? Yeah. So with that out of the way, I'll just close this quickly and then show you how you can use the tool, pretty much just taking into account the filter and then getting all the information you want. So for example, if you wanted only users, right? Let's do a user. Now I know this filter because I have access to. Now we can just copy out all of this also, right? This will give me all user objects, or you can just use the sum account type, pointing into this value. This will also give you the same sort of information. Let me try this. Let me just type in user and see if that works. So I think it should not fail. And I only want to see the name and say member of, right? It's not case sensitive. So member of simply is the attribute that I want to see, right? If I hit enter, and yeah, you know, I hate having to type this password because I'll end up messing it up. You can see that this extracts only the user information, the username, and the respective groups they belong to. Now, a lot of these users don't belong to any specific group, but you can see that now we can sort of slim out our query by only focusing on things that are important to us, right? I only want to see Patrice Lumumba, not all the other information, but I also want to see the groups that they are members of, right? But things like this are very helpful. We could also search for, let's look at our list again. We could search for computers as well, right? And you'll see that this is a very repetitive process, really. All you have to do is just change the filter to what you want. And that's pretty much it. You can extract the information that you're looking for. So we can look for computers by name. Let's do name. And then we can remove this object. And I'll replace this with what I just copied out of the filter sheet. Now, these are some of my favorite objects to look for, right? If I have all users and I have all groups, and then essentially what that allows me to do is to reconcile that if I get all computers, all users, all groups, is to figure out which users belongs to which group and on which computers are they connected to, right? That gives me a very good picture of the environment, similar to something you may have already seen in Bloodhound, where it does all that fancy mapping for you, right? Now, also just because I hate typing the password, I'll use the hyphen small w, and we'll do what Kofi found on his pen test, where I can specify the password.
Look at you now, everybody knows my password.
That's the term user. But hey, now I don't have to type in. I don't have to type the.
Oh, we don't know. We don't know your password. Password is password.
Yes, password, right? And this gives us only the specific thing that we're looking for. So now we know all the computers in the environment, and like Noureddin pointed out earlier, because DNS is in operation, I get to see the actual DNS names for the specific host that I'm looking for. We could also look for things like organizational units. We could look at password policies. Not sure how much time we have, but I mean, those things are things we could easily search for, right? Just change the filter and look for a specific thing. One thing that I perhaps maybe should talk about before we go on will be, for example, SPNs, right? Now, why are SPNs important? We can leverage them for Kerberos. It's like one of the easiest ways to get something you can start hacking away at, right? So let's see if I can find the service principal name. We'll just switch this out and look for all service principal names. Right. So you can see this is not really a very intensive exercise. All you have to do is just switch out the filter name and look for exactly what will benefit you, right? The information that is most relevant to you. So let's do SPN. Control-Shift-V, and let's search for this as well, right? So this will give me all the SPNs. Now, because of experience, right, I typically, what I do is that I would ignore any of the SPNs that are related to things that are non-standard, right? So for example, let me take out name so that this is a little bit more, right? So we can see the actual service principal name here, right?
Yeah.
You know what, let's be even more thorough and just search for that alone, right? Just Control-Shift-V this, and then this will only point out the SPNs. So I know that there is a user account, Zulu, associated with an SPN called SZulu Nakia at bas.wakanda, that's run on port 80, right? Now, this seems non-standard because most of these seem to be related to the KRB TGT account. That account is built in by default, and it's typically leveraged to manage tickets like your TGTs and all of that, right? Something that is not standard means that this password was probably set by a person, not the system, because the KRB TGT account is typically set by the system. It's much harder to crack, but this shows me that this was set by a user, right? Somebody created this user, created a service, and associated this service account with that service. So if I can get the service tickets, I can crack it because it will be a user set password, and people are less secure than systems. So I could potentially gain new credentials to perform further attacks. Right? I think Kofi, you wanted to say something.
Oh, no. That is all what you said about SPN and the significance of it. And what he's doing here did mention something about Bloodhound, right? We are not showing you guys anything extraordinary or new. We're just giving you guys what happens behind the scenes when you run some of these great tools. It's good for you to understand the fundamentals. What happens, what protocols are being called, what information are being called on a network when you run that juicy, fancy looking Bloodhound or any other tools, out there for offensive operations. So that is what we're doing right now. He's showing you what happens behind the scenes.
Yeah. I guess one last thing, let me restart this Windows box, right? Whilst I do that, but one thing that is also really helpful is to get a good sense of systems that are allowed to perform unconstrained delegation. I don't know how many times you found it in your test, Kofi.
Yeah.
Systems that are allowed to perform unconstrained delegation. And I'll explain perhaps for those who may not know what this is. Now, sometimes when there's a service behind another system, for example, maybe there's a database service that sits behind a web page or a website, right? When a regular user attempts to interact with that particular database, it has to go through the system that sits in between them. So that system would need a way of taking my credentials and performing the request on my behalf. So it's allowed to perform an unconstrained delegation. I can actually take my ticket and then make the requests on my behalf for me. This means it has to cache that somewhere in memory, right? And because it's cached in memory, if you can actually exploit that particular operation, you can actually gain additional credentials and perform requests on behalf of, usually it will be on behalf of a high privileged user, right? And that is where unconstrained delegation becomes really, really helpful. I know Kofi has like a very in-depth demo on that, but it's also one of the things that you would want to look for. And so getting like a query that allows you to find that. I'm sorry if you hear any sounds in my room. My son has decided to crawl into my office. He just started crawling and he's coming everywhere that I am, right? So I apologize for the noise. But I was looking for unconstrained delegation. So let's see if we can find unconstrained, if we can spell it correctly. We can simply use this to search for any boxes in the environment that can perform unconstrained delegation. Once again, the principle is really simple. All we have to do is just change out or swap out. Let's see if I can remove this with Control K. All right, and then just remove all of this and replace that with the filter that I just got. Promise this will be the last example I show in Kali. And it looks like there's a box called Baku. How do I know this? Because I listed all the computers earlier. So I know this is not a user, it's a computer. And this user has been allowed to perform unconstrained delegation. This is a Windows Server 2016 server as well. And we could leverage this for further attacks. Any questions before we switch over to Windows briefly? Awesome. All right. Now, this format of data we are seeing is in the Ldap format, right? So it's a lot easier for us to see or visualize as humans. We're moving to a Windows box also to show that you can perform these queries, leverage Ldap to extract additional information as a user, as a regular user on a Windows box. Now, to type Kofi's password, which I hopefully remember. The reason why I like showing this is that this is a very it's a very common thing that I do often, right? When I'm doing like an internal pen test and I'm given access to a box that has some form of scripting allowed. For example, if PowerShell is allowed, as some environments do, you can leverage PowerShell for your queries as well. I also saw a really good link that I think Israel shared that had to do with using DSQuery. And I'd never used DSQuery in the past, right? But Adam has a question. Adam, please go on.
Yeah, I mean, this session is really amazing. And I know there are some guys in there who are offensive guys, and they are looking at it from the offensive perspective. And some of us working as the defense guy are also looking at, okay, if these are some of the loopholes, how do we position ourselves to prepare towards these offensive guys? And we've discussed the issue around Ldap by default not being secure. And so if there's an option to implement a secure one, which will be quite difficult to straight ahead and say, okay, on the AD side, let me disable the service listing on the unsecure one, because the applications or the clients that are consuming that service cannot switch, they all break, exactly. And so you will see a pen test report that comes up, and then there's a recommendation, and probably it's taking like a year or 2 years for the defense guy to fix, because then it's not straightforward, right? And that's how quite sometimes difficult defense job can be. But from your experience point of view and how you visited multiple client environment, have you had experience where you've been into a particular client environment and by default you see that the normal Ldap one has been turned off?
To be honest with you, no. I've always been able to perform some form of enumeration, and most of it has been based on Ldap. I think that's, like you said, it's a hard thing to stop. I've had clients actually say, how do you stop this sort of thing, right? Now, I'd say one of the first things really is there seems to be an overemphasis on the protocol itself, right? Now, as long as you can keep people from getting the credentials or perform anonymous like querying, then you've solved a huge part of the problem, right? For example, if I can't get in, then I cannot perform enumeration at all. And I can only get in if I get some form of credential, or I'm able to get in via leveraging somebody's credential and getting in, right? So that's usually sort of my approach to this. But you do raise a very good question, and I actually don't know how to solve it really, besides doing all the basic things that will prevent somebody from coming in. Eventually they will, but leverage what I said with, or combine what I said with how quickly can you detect, for example, Mamiesi's machine, which she always uses for watching Facebook or etc., performing all of a sudden queries looking for all domain administrators, right? That's very odd. Like things like that will sort of help. But I don't really, to your question, I have never been anywhere where I haven't been able to perform some Ldap-based enumeration. And it's a hard thing to solve, right? I don't know if Kofi or anybody has any. I think
no, same here. Same here. It is one of those things that is hard to solve. Having come across, and I think the reason why maybe Microsoft hasn't pursued forcing this to use only the LDAP S is because LDAP is mostly internal, right? And we have this misconception about when the parameters are internal, we are a little bit relaxed and comfortable than when it's external, all right? Because I can guarantee you if LDAP is external, like in a protocol, these guys will come up with a better solution and then force us to use the LDAP S than, if, because it's inside, internal. Yeah, Israel.
It's just was going to make a similar point because I mentioned this in the group, so I had interest in appreciating how it is structured, and I think the two issues there was the complexity of directory service. Like everything is linked to it. So if you read some of the attacks and the recommendations that were coming, I mean, just like Gavin yourself has said. Everybody keeps pointing you to making sure that the credentials don't get into the wrong hands, but like your client's environment, for instance, they never thought that you're just going to run the history. Nobody ever thought that, hey, let me flash the history off here. And that's how you got in. It's not that the infrastructure itself was not well positioned. You had a tough time, but you got lucky when you had to go in there and run your history, and then it turns out that somebody threw it there. So really, I did a bit of reading, and I didn't find anywhere where they were giving something concrete, whether from Microsoft, or people who have done this work. Everybody points you to the fact that you need to pay attention to the internal environment and make sure the credentials doesn't get into the wrong hands. And it's all because of the complexity of directory service. Yeah.
All right, Nihak.
Yeah. So I think my question I wanted to ask, Kofi, you touched on it briefly. I was about asking that yes, we all know, looking at this presentation and looking at LDAP itself. LDAP itself is vulnerable. So my question was, I was about to ask that: is it that Microsoft is intentionally leaving it that way? Or is it that they can't find a fix to it? But LDAP S is there. So why is it that we know LDAP is vulnerable? It's vulnerable in this, by design. Why can't they just push in a patch or bring a patch where LDAP S is rather default? So you turn it off or something. But I think you started talking about it, and then you moved to another thing. So I wanted to ask, can't Microsoft, wouldn't it be best for Microsoft to touch this thing once and for all, and then maybe make LDAP as default or something?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So
okay, I want to say something.
Go ahead, Gavin.
And so you saw a simple authentication where nothing was obfuscated when we interacted with the Active Directory server from Linux, right? Now it's because, and Kofi built this lab, so you can blame Kofi for this, right? He did not set up LDAP S, right? LDAP secure LDAP, because then he would need to actually set up certificates and do that sort of authentication, right? Now, in Active Directory itself, it's using LDAP version 3, and you would not find this sort of thing. Like, I have never done it in an environment where I'd seen people or in boxes, Windows boxes, doing LDAP simple authentications with the domain controller itself, right? You'd see that typically with integrations where somebody sets up their own open LDAP server, or they're connecting to the LDAP server from a non-standard Windows box. So by default, Microsoft is doing, I'm not defending Microsoft, but I think they're doing very well in that regard. So you cannot man in the middle the traffic, right? There's an LDAP attack called LDAP injection, which typically, if somebody's doing like a web-based request by LDAP and they don't sanitize the inputs correctly from the user, you can actually inject your own LDAP queries and do stuff, right? But by default, just to clear the air, Microsoft actually implement that LDAP S. Right? So sorry, Kofi, please go on.
Yeah, so I was still going
Question.
to. Yeah.
What sort of monitoring does LDAP do by itself? It does it have like some detailed monitoring for maybe insights? And do you get the opportunity to push this to maybe your SIMs for audits, or what level of auditing does it do, just from your experience?
Yeah, we didn't look into that. I don't know if Jervin did, but I believe that it is, everything that happens within AD has its own event code. All right, it's like doing a Kerberos in attack. Each of these protocols would have their own event code, and that is how most of DCs or AD environment have event monitoring in place. So I believe if you want to implement like some sort of like a SIM solution or monitoring, you can write up some PowerShell, especially with the PowerShell version 5, up having this deep monitoring logs. You can write up some queries and then look for that particular code, which are basically Ldap in nature, and then be able to see if it's malicious or not. Go ahead.
You have like network related monitoring. You can actually see if there are any requests. So you can see like variations or anomalies in certain requests that are not like standard requests, right?
Yeah.
You can flag on those.
Yeah, and let's also be conscious about this. And I'm going to go back to Nihak's question again about if Microsoft can just patch this and then all of our headache will be gone. I don't think that is going to happen. And one of the reasons is because Ldap is a protocol and it's not actually owned by Microsoft, first of all, right? And two, some of these protocols, you are running them on an environment where you may have legacy systems. Now, some of these systems may not, since they are very, very old, they may not, support or be able to work well with an SSL-based protocol. So basically, you will still find this Ldap with no SSL implementation so that it can be compatible with legacy systems in the environment. And that's a second, reason why there may not be a complete wipe of, the Ldap without the SSL implementation. This goes back to also compare this to other protocols, such as FTP. You're always going to find FTP somewhere on the environment. And it's because not all systems are going to support SSH, right? So as much as we give those recommendations in our report, we damn sure know that it is not going anywhere anytime soon. And that is why we still have the Ldap without the Ldap SSL in place. So that is, kind of basically my response to Nihak's question. Now I have lost my thought of train. I was going to say something. What were you saying? I forgot. I was going to say something more to that.
Yeah, but with this sort of conscious support for backward compatibility, are we ever going to get to secure by design?
No, we are not. It's something that, see, we have to be very honest with ourselves. We do our best. We can never have 100% security. We do our best by having, as long as you have human beings who are making decisions, we can never have 100%. All right. And some of these things are always coming back to bite us because, like we said, these things predates us, like way back when tech was first implemented. They didn't think that we're going to be malicious in nature. And then they had to, so we've been patching ever since the first attack was, was written. We've been patching things. We've been atoning for the sins of our great parents who built these protocols from the beginning, right? And it's going to be like a compounded patching. That is the reason why when we patch, we still find vulnerabilities in our patches. I mean, we find vulnerabilities in SSL, TLS, right? Yeah. These are supposed to be secure, it's
a patch. It's a patch ecosystem.
Yes. So yeah, it will still be there. Yeah, that is why we keep seeing that. We see, we keep patching even security. All right, go ahead, Jeremy.
And I was just going to say, just move to the cloud and everything will be secure.
Yeah.
You have started again.
Yeah, I know he wants to fight. All right. So let's move on.
Yeah, so I'll wrap this up quickly. We've already seen how to leverage Ldap for, or tools that can use Ldap for enumeration, right? The key thing is really just knowing who to query, having their respective credentials, and then the filter, right? You can say, give me everything, or you can say, give me only this thing that I'm looking for. So for example, over here, let me pull this away from my screen. we have PowerShell, and essentially, I'm showing you this because I typically would write this into a single script. I'm showing you something that I use on some of my assessments, because what happens is that when I try to drop tools like Power View, etc., on the target, AV will catch it immediately, right? Or something in the shape of detection and response will stop me from using it. But I can still make my request. Sometimes I can't use tools on the box, but if I'm allowed to perform any PowerShell query, then I can actually leverage Ldap, right? Ignore all the fancy code at the top. Essentially, all I'm doing is just automatically detecting who I should query. For example, in the previous one where I used Ldap search, I specified go to this Ldap server, right? That means I need to know the Ldap server. In this case, with PowerShell, I can say, hey, automatically figure out who the Ldap server is, because you're connected to the domain already, so you already know who the Ldap server is, right? Now, once you have figured that out, go ahead and give me some information, for example, computer-related information, print out the name and operating system. Essentially, I'm just running a loop that's giving me all the properties, and I'm saying, I just want the name and operating system, right? And I could take this out and it will just print out every computer for me, but just to keep things clean, that's all I'm going to keep this to. And you don't have to worry about the code if you don't program or you don't do any form of scripting. You can just make sure the filter is the only thing you need to worry about, right? These are just to make things look pretty. So if I run this, for example, this is going to print every computer on the domain and the operating system that they have. I could just switch this out also for the user, and the user will not have an operating system, right? So maybe we can do member of like so, and then we can run this as well. And this should tell us, let's go ahead and save, and it will tell us the users and the groups that they belong to, right? Now, question for you guys, right? I'm not typing in any credentials here like I did for the first instance with Ldap search. So how is this actually performing the request for me if I'm not typing the credentials?
Good question.
Yeah, I'm sure it's doing some form of, okay, maybe I should leave that. I don't like asking people questions because I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Yes, Adam, please go ahead.
Okay, so if it's a Windows, I'll give it a try. If it's a Windows machine, then the machine is joined to the network. It has already established trust.
Exactly.
And so you could query the AD with its session. Is that what is happening?
Yeah, you're correct, right?
Yeah.
So it's doing the bind for me, right? So it's actually authenticating and saying, hey, when I do this particular function, it's going to actually figure out the path by doing a bind and getting, the right information for me without me having specified that, right? So also we have, like, I'm logged in, so my TGT is being leveraged as well. Now, with that in mind, how do you think I can abuse this logic, right? For example, if it's authenticating for me, and this particular function actually has the ability to take in username and passwords. So if this Ldap query will authenticate or attempt to perform a bind, which will do an authentication for me, then I can use it to figure out if I have like passwords, or I can figure out, like, I can do a password attack or like a password spray. And I have that in here. Let me run this as well.
And while whilst you're doing that, let me maybe elaborate what a password spray attack is, because not all of us here may be privy to understand what that attack is. And also before that, let me go back and also describe the environment, because again, some of you may not know the distinction between the Windows environment, the Windows box and the Kali. So the Kali box is not domain joined. Okay, and that is the reason why he had to provide the credentials for the user, dummy user, and the password. So if it's not domain joined, then you need to talk to domain or the Ldap server by providing the username and password as part of the authentication piece. The Windows box, on the other hand, is domain joined, and he has logged in with a valid domain user. So already the trust has been established before, because it went through the Kerberos authentication. username and password, and then went to the KDC, and that is beyond the scope of this class. I mean, the scope of this webinar. The KDC back and forth and has the Kerberos, ticket, TGT, in hand. So there was no need for him to provide a password for the user. And that is the reason why here with our query, no user, password, required. Adam, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's very, very important that you touched on that. If you look at what we did in the Kali, and then we use the Wireshark to inspect the traffic to understand which components were going in clear test, and then you compare it to this scenario where we are not entering credentials, we are leveraging on the machine session. What will happen when we attempt to capture the packet?
Yeah, I think, we didn't practice for this. I don't think we looked into it. Do we have Wireshark on this box?
Unfortunately.
So that we can capture the Ldap query here as well. And then let's see the difference between the Kali one and then the Windows one. Whilst you're looking for Wireshark on this box, going back to password-free attack. So typically, the traditional sense of password brute force attack, I don't have it, shoot. All right. The traditional sense of password brute force attack is typically you have one username, and then you can provide several passwords. It can be 2, 300, 1,000, 1 million against just one user, and find out if that user is using one of those passwords from that 1,000 list. Obviously, this was great back in the days when there was no account lockout. So you can run so many password checks against one user, and there will never be any password or account lockout for a particular user. So the admins went back and then began to place an account lockout for, let's say, X amount of login tries. So most domain environment may have, let's say, maybe up to 5 tries, and then it will lock out the account. So if you try invalid credential for maybe 5 times, the account is locked out. Now the bad guys went back and then devised a new technique called password spray attack or reverse brute forcing, where instead of having one username and then try multiple passwords, what if we have multiple usernames and try one password against that list and find out if one of them is using a particular password? Of course, it's an art of science. Attack is all about art of imagination, being able to think outside the box, right? So there's no magic in picking a right password. It depends on so many factors. So for instance, let's say that your target is based off in Ghana. They're based off in Accra. And even within Accra, they're based off somewhere in West Legon, right? So you can use all this information and guess a password and see, let's say you have a bunch of users, 1,000, let's say, and then you pick maybe, let's say, Legon 123, thinking that one of these users, because of the location of where the company is and the office, whatever, may use that particular locality for their password. So these things are based off on experience. Some of them choose password based on the season, they choose based on their pet, they choose based on their best sports, the capital city, whatever, but there's no science to that. So for password-free attack, we choose one commonly known or guessable password and then try that against or spray it against multiple users and see which one of them is using that particular password.
Yeah, Kofi, I was going to say that Nice password is probably Legon.
All right. Yeah, Desmond.
Yeah, so the account lockout logic is based only on the password, right?
Yes. But right now they are building.
So you could do the reverse?
No, for the reverse, yes, I'm going to give you the reverse one. The reverse, and you ask, okay, don't we have anything against the reverse too? Well, yeah. Microsoft specifically, in fact, just recently, one of my pen tests. So if you run password spray attack against, let's say, 365, it has this AI intelligence built into it now that it will look at your source IP address, and maybe after, let's say, 5 tries from the same source IP address.
Same source, different users. Exactly. Then you know something is happening.
Yes, within a specific time frame, it can now trigger an account lockout. Now, it would not you would think, now this is something that's outside of the scope of this class. It will tell you that the account is locked, but the account itself is not locked. It is blocking your IP address. So when you run the query against here, nowadays you run against Microsoft, like 365, you perform like any external pen test, and you perform some query against that environment. After some time, it will tell you the account is locked out. The user's account is not locked out per se. They will not even see it's locked out, but it's blocking your IP address. So you wouldn't even think that your IP address is being blocked. It will just tell the account is locked out. So, yeah.
Second point.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nihal, hold on. So, yeah, when I look at your code on the second line, you have you're calling the Ldap protocol. So the question is, are we not going to
No, the second one. The second line.
Line 2.
Line 2.
Okay, this one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
You're calling Ldap, not Ldap S. So on Adam's question as to whether if we do the sniffing, we are going to get something different. That's a bit tricky for me, because if we are still using the Ldap without any security, we're still going to end up with clear text. Or do we anticipate a mechanism within the Windows environment that even without the Ldap S would, leverage on some encryption or some mumbling of the information?
Yeah, very good question. So my current attempts to interact with the Ldap server, even though I've specified Ldap here, it's going to leverage, because I'm not specifying the credentials, it's going to leverage my tickets, right?
Yeah.
Which is already protected by cables, right? So yeah. But very good eye, right? I didn't think about this, but that's a very good question.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Yeah. Nihak.
Yes. So, a follow-up question with your answer.
Can you please confirm if your password was Legon123 before you continue? All right. Need doesn't want to come.
Why do you want to put this guy on spot? Nee, don't mind him. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. So like we were saying about password spraying attack, the mechanism that Microsoft has built. So what you are trying to say is, if it's someone who knows like what you just explained, and you know that okay, it's not that your account has been blocked or the account has been blocked, but it's just the IP that is being blocked. It means that anytime you change the IP address, you can still continue the password spraying, right?
Of course you can, man. You can. And
yeah, but I still see some challenge. I still see some challenge there. If it's machine learning doing the trick, how many IPs are you able to change? Because it's reading at a certain threshold. Or have you been successful in doing that? I would be really interested in knowing if you've been successful in beating the timer, the countdown, the rate limit, because it's machine learning. If you change your IP and it's supposed to probably pick you on maybe the 5th try or the 6th try, it's still going to pick you. How many IPs can you change?
But you see, that is a misconception. We think it's AI or it's ML, so we can't beat them. We can. I have beat them.
I'm all ears.
So these tools, of course, the people who design these tools have thought about all these things. So you can actually customize you can customize your command options, right? And then set up some delays, some jitter, and also delays within each of your requests. And that is what I did even with one of my tests, okay? Again, yeah, because even it's AI, but it still has a logic that it's using. It will say, you know what, if you see requests per every second or every nanosecond, begin to block it, right? Well, what if I set my request maybe every 2 minutes or every 5 minutes, and then set my jitter to another number? So these are all things that distinguishes us from the script kiddies. Because for the script kiddie, they will just want it to, and then they'll be blocked and be like, what the hell is going on here? By you,
then they get tired.
Because you're a ninja, you are able to actually customize your options and then try to understand how the AI will, because the whole thing here is a cat and mouse thing.
Yeah.
They catching us, we go back, we rethink, we tweak our code or our command. They catch us, we go back and then we tweak it, right? So yes, I have done multiple ones where I have seen me being blocked. And then I go back and then rechange my request time frame to maybe 5 minutes, per 5 minutes. And then I realized, okay, I'm able to beat it, right? So that is one point. The second point is you can also rotate your IP addresses. Yeah, they will still catch you, but if let's say I provide like a class B, because the tools can actually take a whole class as your rotating IP addresses, okay? And if I'm able to take class B, that is millions of possible IP addresses within, let's say, a space, right? Of course, you are going to have to have like a bankroll to pay for all that, like, IP addresses, right? But the whole point here is it's a cat and mouse situation. The implementations will catch us. We go back, we rethink, we tweak our code, our line of command, and we'll put it again until we are able to juggle back and forth. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
No problem.
Whilst I haven't done this myself, I think I was listening to Black Hills Information talk about a pen test they won, and they said they've performed a password spray that lasted over a month or 2 months, right?
There you go. I wouldn't be surprised.
That
That
is
is like maybe they run like a red team operation.
Exactly, right. So they
That
do.
would be a pen test.
Yeah, no.
You'll be kicked out before your pen test is over. Yeah.
Nobody's going to pay you for that length of time. No.
Yeah.
All right, but very, very interesting conversations. I really benefited a lot from them.
Yeah.
Thanks for the questions. Now, perhaps this might relate more to the question you're asking, Israel. Now, over here, what the script is simply doing is doing the same thing.
Nihak has his
All right, Ni, please go on.
I'm worried, Devin, a bit. Be kind enough to share your scripts.
Okay, well, I'll actually do, but I'll send you a screenshot of mine. So yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you for that.
We can monetize it. You can talk to me later.
I hear you. This man is trying to get me fired. Okay, so the script is simply the same thing you've seen from before, right? Once again, do not worry about any of the other things in there. The only variation we really have in here is we're taking input from a file with a get content. And then essentially what we are doing is that we are running the same query we ran previously. The only difference is that now we are saying that use whatever string that I obtained from the Ldap provider path, and then whatever username that I supply, which is what we are taking from the file, and then supply any password that I give it. Now, what happens when you perform a successful bind is that there's a directory object that's created, right? So that means that if I store that directory object in something, it's going to have a value, right? That's if I perform a successful authentication. Now, if it's not successful, nothing gets created, right? So based on that logic, if I authenticate successfully, then something gets created, right? And if not, nothing gets created. So that's all I'm using to validate whether the credentials are successful or not, right? So if nothing is created, so if it's null, if there's nothing created, then obviously I didn't authenticate properly, right? But if it did authenticate and something got created, then you found whatever credential you supplied must be correct, right? That's pretty much the whole logic, right? Let's see how this runs when we actually leverage this. I just imported the script so I can run it like spray. And I'll give 1,000 cities to anybody who can tell me what the password is for this user. Probably have seen it already, so maybe I shouldn't promise anybody. I'm lying, I take it back. And then there's a file called users.txt. Like Kofi said, it's just a list of users. Now, how would I have obtained this? I'd have obtained this from my previous Ldap enumeration, right? I know all the users now, and I can say, hey, for this X amount of time, now this script is running, it will run pretty quickly, right? But if I were to put in like a sleep function here and say, wait, sleep for X amount of time, then it will go a lot slower, and I might be able to fulfill some of the conditions Kofi just mentioned, right? If I hit enter, well, we already know the password, right? This password is password 123. We've seen this before, but the script has been able to validate that this is the valid credentials for the user, dummy user, right? Which you've seen previously. This is the same box that we were playing with when we were on the Linux machine, right? It's dummy user, and we know the credentials was password 123, right? So we can leverage the same logic to perform a password spray across the domain to figure out credentials. Right? So just using the same LDAP thing that we found in the past. All right. Okay, there's one last thing that I think that this was what started the conversation. So thank you. I think it was Israel, you shared that, right? Essentially, if you do not have PowerShell, and you cannot do this from Linux or you are on a Windows box, you can also use DSQuery to perform the same enumerations we've done in the past, right? So I just copy and paste them because I really do not want to type this out. I don't think you want to sit here and watch me type any of these things out. It'll take us forever. And we can run this in PowerShell as well, and then pretty much get the same outputs, right? So for example, the only thing that changes is the filter. And here, instead of printing out the attributes name, I only want the name and members, groups that every user is a member of. And if I were to run this, the output is not the cleanest, but I have a good idea of who the domain admin is. I know it's Patrice Lumumba, and Thomas Sankara is also a member of this weird group name, right? And the same, I'm sorry if this is too small. Can I make this bigger? I guess I can zoom in. And hopefully this is a lot easier for you to see, right? But the queries are pretty much the same as you've seen in the past. The only difference is that we are only adding or changing the filter. We're using DSQuery. DSQuery is a tool that allows us to query the directory server, and we can extract all the relevant information. For example, one very useful one is this one. Find users whose passwords, who do not have a password expiry. I think this is the one. Okay, this one is not, do not have passwords, but there's a query that's really helpful if you look for users whose passwords never expire. Now, what's the benefit of finding a user whose password never expires, right? Means you have persistence, you don't have to worry about or the password being changed at some point, and you can leverage that for persistence if you want to. Those would be a good filter to include in your searches. If there are no questions, I will go back to the slides. Okay, there's a question from Desmond. Yes, please.
It's actually a contribution. I don't know if I'm right though. So we can actually run this same, offensive process for a defensive measure, as in auditing your AD.
Excellent.
To find out some of these password never expires and some of these objects that are actually making you vulnerable.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is like something we always emphasize on, right? Like I always say, if you're not a criminal, then the only reason why you are doing this is to help secure the environment, right? And so, I mean, blue teamers, attackers, you can see that this does not require any extraordinary technical ability, right? Once you understand the process, you can automate this, right? You can run this yourself. And just a quick one, I actually put all of this, because I do this often when I'm in AD environments, I put all of this together in a single tool that allows me to quickly run this across the domain and perform the sort of enumeration, right? So for example, if I were to run this, it's called domain enum. I'm not good with names, so I called it whatever was the first thing that came to my head. You can say that domain enum, and what you want to do is get from the domain all your domain controllers, right? This will scan the domain, figure who the domain controller is, and show you the IP address, right? You can say, show me all users, and it will do that for you. You can do this with Power and etc. as well, right? I only did this because, well, if I was doing a test in an environment with AV, it wouldn't let me run Power and I would use this, right? And I'll share this as well. You can go ahead and just use it for your tests. But very good points you made there, Desmond. Yeah, awesome. All right, so I'll go back to the slides. And then the plan was to discuss defenses, but I think we've discussed this at length, right? The whole discussion has been about how to best secure an environment. And I know Neil gets me now because now I can't find my presentation. Not sure what you guys can see now, but please tell me you are seeing only the presentation.
Yeah, we are seeing.
Yeah, enough talk. Show me a demo.
All right, so I'll quickly skip through this. We just talked about the offensive usage of Ldap, and we've looked at all the things we can glean from Ldap. And this is a key point, right? And I think we're beginning to realize this. Without context, really, the attack just looks like regular operations, right? And yeah, thankfully we were able to do a good demo. Nothing broke, at least.
Yeah, man, I can't believe you took that risk, because I told you to record it. Let's just give it to these guys and let's walk away.
Yeah,
No, we prayed. We prayed before the.
I poured some libation before this.
Yeah. So the demo gods were they were in check.
And these are some of the things you can do to sort of secure your environment, right? Introduce security in the LDAP mechanism itself. Make sure that you have proper access controls in place so people don't get access to LDAP and be able to run queries willy-nilly. And the reason why I mentioned baseline monitoring is that if you see variations of queries that are not regular, which is sort of hard, right? It's very easy to say. But if you see people running queries or queries from a box that does not typically perform that sort of query, like looking for domain controllers, or looking for, domain controllers will be hard to figure out, but domain admins, and like a pattern of behavior that is really suspicious, this helps you, right? The same information that is used for the offense can be leveraged for detecting if there's something weird going on, at the very least, right? And I've also seen this advice. I think it's awesome, right? I think this was the first conversation I had with Kofi when we met, right? The first time I met Kofi, we were talking about cyber deception, right? Using things like honey accounts and honey tokens. It's just because, well, if it's an account that it's not meant to be used, and you see somebody, the only reason why somebody will interact with an account that you haven't created for any user, that you've stored in your environment only for detecting malicious activity, if that account is ever used, will be because there's some malicious activity going on, right? So you can just sprinkle some of that into your environment, and these should be helpful as well. Right? And that brings us to the end of all the talking. Please, if you have any questions, Adam has a question. Please go on, Adam.
Okay, so on your last point, from offensive point of view, how you could also detect that this is a honey account, which could be maybe the last time password was changed, or whether account is set to expire. What are some of the things that you could observe around honey account to know that this is an account for detection?
Yeah, that's a hard question, actually. You did mention a few things, right? For example, I like to look at the time the account was created. Has the password ever been changed for that account, right? Is the account being used? Has it touched anything in the environment? Or is it just an account that's been idle for X amount of time? Has it ever logged into a machine, right? Things like that, things that I would expect a regular user to do. Now, I'd say I'll be the first to admit this. I typically do not look out for honey tokens because perhaps in a pen test, it's not a very big deal, even if they detect your activity. Right? In a red team, it will be more crucial that you get you fly under the radar. But things like that, right? I try to look for attributes of the account that a typical user would have. Now, if it's weird, the account has never logged into a machine, the password has never been changed, the account was created at this time, it's never really done any of these things, then that's very suspicious behavior, right? And I would be quickly suspect of such an account. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Right. Great question. I appreciate that, because cyber defense is big. And Kofi also did not have a good answer for me the day I spoke to him about cyber deception, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so that again, these are some of the things that there's no particular way of doing them, so they change based on whoever is implementing. One thing you also want to look at is the naming convention of the organization, the typical naming convention, and how a name may deviate from the typical. So let's say the naming convention is, let's say, last name dot first name at domain whatever, right? Or let's say last name initial and the first name, right? So you are going to have to put one together and then find out if this particular name or user account is way different from how the others are structured. And that could also be a point to give up. But otherwise, there isn't like any structured way of figuring out what is a deceptive account or a deceptive computer or not. One I have seen recently, which was in a computer, I mean, it wasn't a user, but it was a system, was just a firewall. All right. And it had like almost all the port numbers open. And, you know, a script kiddie sees that, they'll be like, oh, man, I can see like these guys are vulnerable to MySQL, they are vulnerable to this and that and that, and then you just be chasing your, you know, your tail around them. So again, there is no, you know, as an experience, you know, you earn these things or you find these things based on experience. After you've done multiple things, you see them as soon as they, you know, they sit right in your face that this is not a good account. It's just something to throw you off. Yeah. All right.
All right. Question. So this is very random, but what business madness would make Ldap sit on the public? What will make it public facing? Which scenario will ever make Ldap public facing?
No, I don't know if this is, so Microsoft actually employs Ldap if you interact with Azure AD DS, right?
So AD in the cloud.
Yeah, AD in the cloud. So you can do like
and then syncing to on-prem.
Yeah, and then syncing with like, so AD in the cloud. So you use like maybe a browser-based interaction via Ldap to Azure AD DS in the cloud. That will sync with Azure AD itself. And then that will sync via Azure AD Connect with an on-prem system, right? So there's Ldap employed in that particular connection. Also, just a distinction. Azure AD DS is like Active Directory DS, whereas Azure AD is more like an identity management thing, right? I think I have a diagram where Microsoft sort of shows this. So let me see if I can find it and I'll share that with you. I think this is
okay, so Azure in the cloud will go via HTTPS. So if there is an Ldap integration, that will be Ldap over HTTPS.
Yes, most likely. I believe that will be over a secure channel.
Right. Okay.
I have not implemented this before, but I've read a few Microsoft articles where they talk about how to do the integration. And let's do this very quickly. So always careful what I share on my screen. This one, this is what I'm referring to. Hopefully you can see this, right?
Yeah, I can.
So this is a user signing in via browser. I believe all of this is in a controlled environment, right? So it's not exactly public facing as we would have like a typical public facing server, but this will be in the cloud environment, right? Where Ldap itself is being leveraged in that particular environment. And then you have the on-prem, which is using Azure AD Connect to interact with the various cloud-based services.
So in this case, user is interacting with the AD environment via a web browser.
Via web browser, yes.
So does it bring the risk at? Okay, forget that. All right, it's okay.
No, it's a good question to ask, right? I think all of this is in the controlled environment.
It is still within the internal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I knew where you were going to point at that if the Ldap protocol is exposed on the internet, but no, I think
no, it's not.
The boundary stops at between the browser and
the virtual network.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's where it stops.
Okay, now how do you clean this? Okay.
You don't clean it. Nobody's saying you.
Yeah. All right, guys.
Charlie, thank you.
This was great. I know, I didn't even think we'd go beyond 2 hours. And yeah, we did. So
thank you. Yeah, and we had the numbers to 16 out of 20 people who said their time was good for them.
Yeah, that's good.
We really appreciate.
Yeah,
the next time we find something quick, we'll drop it. We'll get who's ready to resource us, and we can do that. And if we will be consistent about it, then maybe we can start publicizing our sessions, you know, do like a little promo artwork, promo videos. Just share it so that others beyond age can jump on it.
Yeah.
We still have our GamePad plans intact. I'll get back to Ghana. I'll go and see the dean. NIHAC is actually doing Agent there now, so that's one leg in for us as well. We can have that discussion with them and see how best